So there's a lot going on news-wise right now. The Labour Party conference is underway in Liverpool. I may make a video about that, about the direction of Labour and just UK politics in general. The state funeral of Shinzo Abe in Japan. It's apparently quite divisive. Abe's death, of course, was a shock to the nation, but in life he was a controversial figure, so apparently that's divided the country. Um, Situation in Russia, of course. I think I'd cautiously say it may be the beginning of the end for Putin, but still as dangerous as ever and possibly even more so. But what's happening now is you're having a situation where apparently one of the recruiting officers was shot yesterday because the guy didn't want his friend who had no military experience to be drafted. No military experience. So ostensibly he hadn't even been a reservist. Um, in the Chechen Wars, I'll just say this in passing, in the Chechen Wars, one of the things that went against the Yeltsin administration was the anger of the mothers whose sons died in Chechnya, and that turned against Yeltsin. Um, so this could be a similar thing, but on an even bigger scale. I think there's very real ripples of discontent, and the Kremlin shackles on the media can only last so long because people on the ground are going to start this isn't like this is coming from the West. This is actually what they are experiencing on the ground in Russia. So, it would be easy to say, oh, it's all Western lies, but they are actually now experiencing it themselves. So, I think finally seeing what a thuggish regime this is. It's not just in Moscow. Apparently, even in remote parts of Siberia, dissent is growing. But Russia's a country of 140 million people, so we shouldn't be complacent. Um, I think Putin's end might come from within. But the other big story that I want to focus on is these protests in Iran. Um, I've read an interesting article in the Daily Mail about this. Just a point, by the way, on if I quote newspapers, it shouldn't necessarily be seen as I'm endorsing that particular paper. I read all papers, even papers I don't particularly care for. I don't like the Daily Mail's almost sycophantic attitude to Boris Johnson, for example. But occasionally they do raise interesting reports and angles on things that other papers don't necessarily touch on. So this is the article. I'm not going to read it all out, but it's basically talking about how this anger against the regime in Tehran has now hit London and other cities. I'm just going to. Well, actually, you know what? It's not too long. I may as well read it out. The reports by Connor Stringer and Frankie Fajardo. Protesters tried to storm the Iranian embassy in London last night amid a rising fury at the death of a young woman in Tehran. Riot police clashed with hundreds of demonstrators as rocks and chairs were hurled at the Knightsbridge building. Footage taken from outside the embassy showed men and women fighting with police as officers swung their batons and in one case tackled a man to the ground. In another violent clip, a man accused of being pro-regime was punched and hit with a bottle by the crowd as outnumbered officers ran for cover. The protests at the embassy then moved to the regime-controlled Islamic Centre of England in Maida Vale, where one man scaled one of the mosque's towers and unfurled Iran's former national flag from before 1979, so that would have been the era of the Shah, as the mob chanted death to the Islamic Republic. Just a point on that, I saw footage of the Queen visiting Iran in the early 60s, and what a different situation it was then. The protests were the latest in a string that broke out around the world following the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody in Tehran. The 22-year-old Kurdish woman was detained by Iran's morality police, who apparently deemed that she was wearing her hijab too loosely. London protester Camilla K, 27, said, I love my religion, but this regime in Iran is not Islam. They've taken it to the next level. Scotland Yard said 5 people were arrested on suspicion of violent disorder offences, adding that several police officers were hurt during the protests. Meanwhile, other solidarity protests in Europe also turned ugly. In Paris, demonstrators fought riot squads who used tear gas to try and control them. Protests in cities including Berlin, Brussels, Istanbul, Madrid, and New York City also took place. Miss Amini's death has reignited anger in Iran over issues including restrictions on personal freedoms and strict dress code for women. Women have played a prominent role in the protests, with some burning their headscarves while others have publicly cut their hair as furious crowds called for the downfall of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The protests are the largest to sweep the country since demonstrations over fuel protests in 2019. Protests over Ms. Amini's death have spread across at least 46 cities, towns, and villages in Iran. Just not just Tehran. Much like the protests in Russia aren't just confined to Moscow, this is nationwide. State TV suggested on Saturday that 41 protesters and police have been killed since the unrest erupted on September 16th. It said official statistics would be released by the Interior Ministry. Hardline President Ibrahim Raisi, this is a man known as the Butcher of Tehran, warned of the need to deal decisively with those who oppose the country's tranquility. Iranian police said Ms. Amini died of a heart attack and was not mistreated, but her family has cast doubt on these claims. Iran's foreign ministry said it summoned Simon Shercliffe, UK ambassador to Iran, over the UK is hosting a varsity language media outlets critical of the country's response to the disorder. So there's a few things to process here. This is not the first time Iran has seen angry protests against the regime. There was a so-called Green Revolution in 2009. I say so-called because it wasn't a full-scale revolution. To be a full-scale revolution, there has to be a change. But it was a widespread uprising, widespread protests. That was the events which saw the death of young Neda Sultan, in images that shocked the world. Then, of course, the fuel protests in 2019, and now this. Um, it seems that very sporadically these sort of situations break out, and it's very clear that a lot of Iranians despise the regime, clearly more than they ever despised the Shah. Um, but they never quite seem to get to the momentum where to the point of, a full blown revolution. And I don't think it'll be any different this time, unfortunately. I don't blame her family for casting doubt on that because this was a young woman. The chances that she had a heart attack, unless she had some sort of pre-existing condition, which apparently she didn't, that seems dubious. I think it's much more plausible that they were rough with her, and this is the consequences. But it also shows the abysmal treatment of women in Iran. Um, Regarding the clashes in London, I understand their anger, but taking it out on British police is wrong. Um, this is a sovereign country; they shouldn't be behaving like that in the UK, as much of the British people, myself included, would be sympathetic to their anger, that's just not the way to do it. I think there should be protests outside the Iranian embassy for sure. That should be protected. Attacking the police, and of course, the police have to protect the embassy. If they don't, let's say the protesters storm the embassy, I don't know, hold ambassadors hostage or something, or it escalates in that sense. Iran would accuse Britain of not protecting it, and it would lead to, well, a very serious international fallout. So of course the police have to protect embassies. It's the same with the Chinese embassy. If you had Hong Kong protesters outside the Chinese embassy, I absolutely 100% support the right to do that. But the police have to do the job. They have to protect embassies, just like the embassy in Tehran has to be protected, and embassies around the world have to be protected. This is something that even rogue regimes understand. Um, but I do think the Tehran regime is uh, repugnant. I think it has a complete contempt for human rights. It's important to understand the president doesn't have absolute power. Um, Everything comes back to the supreme leader now. They've officially sent their condolences to this young woman's family, but it's crocodile tears because it's the very system that they enable that led to her death in the first place. Um, but I also think this is an opportunity to highlight the hypocrisy of some Western feminists and Islamists who insist that women have a choice. Now, I want to be clear about this. I have absolutely nothing against women who choose to wear the hijab. Um, as a matter of record, one of my neighbours does. and I've always got on quite well with her. I mean, I don't know her that well, but we've always, said hello in passing, and just good neighbours. So I've no problem with women who wear the hijab, and I actually support the right to do so. I wouldn't necessarily go down the French path of totally banning it. Although I think there's no equivalency between what happens in the West and what happens to non-Muslims in Islamic jurisdictions. But anyway, I digress. The point I'm making is I would respectfully say to those women who say, this is my choice, that's fine, maybe it's your choice. But you cannot look at this situation and say women in Iran have a choice, because they clearly don't. They clearly face beatings, imprisonment, and even death if they defy these morality laws. And I think it is a dangerously misogynistic attitude to say that if a woman isn't covered up, she's somehow a loose woman, as if that would justify a man sexually assaulting or raping her, of which there's never an excuse. Um, but it's fundamentally an extremely misogynistic attitude of a woman's morality needs to be protected. What I say to hijabi women is that that's your right. You wear it if you want to, but don't tell other women that they somehow are losing their morality or they don't have morality if they choose not to wear it. And to be fair, a lot of men are just as angry. They see this as wrong, and they are also angrily protesting. They're sick of their sisters being treated this way. I mean, the thing about Iran, it would be wrong to dismiss Iran as just a country of Islamists. There are lots of young Iranians who know the regime is rotten and they want change. Um, some of the most intelligent people I've ever met have been Iranians. I've known a few. It's a country, I'm talking about the country here, not the regime, that I respect. It's one of the world's oldest civilizations, a point they like to emphasize. Although I would put a caveat with that. Simply having a very long history doesn't mean that it can't be criticized. It's the same arguments used for China. Um, Unfortunately, I don't think this is going to see the regime toppled. But hopefully there'll be enough anger that it will lead to some reforms, at least maybe a toning down of the morality police. I don't know. That might be wishful thinking because these thugs are, you know, very, very hard line. The current president is more of a hardliner than his predecessor. So it's difficult to see much optimism in the situation there. But clearly it shows the very real anger and unease that there is. And surely those clerics must be worried at the top about this anger on the streets because this is happening now every few years. I mean, 2019, well, that's 3 years ago. What's going to be the next issue? Is it going to be maybe some young man dies in detention for protesting? Maybe it's another woman dies from the morality police. Um, it could be any number of things. Um, so if the regime wants to survive, it's going to have to moderate itself. Ideally, I'd like them thrown away. I think they're a disgrace. I think they're rotten. I think it's one of the world's most brutal regimes. But that's idealism. In reality, the best outcome of this would be that they are sufficiently frightened by the protests that they don't take a hardline approach, although dozens of people have been killed. They realize that they're going to have to moderate if they want to survive. In other words, disband the morality police. Well, that isn't going to happen. At least tell them to loosen up a bit. I mean, it sounds like absurd, obviously, but I'm just thinking that it's difficult to be optimistic because these sort of protests have happened before and nothing's changed. The West can impose sanctions, but the problem is with sanctions, it often ends up hurting ordinary people. And if you get a situation, for example, if there's sanctions on areas like aviation, I'm not suggesting that will happen with this. But then you get the problem whereby they have to rely on freight that's very old, and then you have a high rate of accidents. I mean, Iran, along with Russia, is one of the countries that has proportionately some of the most aviation disasters. Um, then there's areas like, Iran's a country that suffers earthquakes. It has significant poverty. Um, there's a lot of areas there where sanctions might backfire, and Iranians who might despise the regime might resent the West for the sanctions. So there's no easy answers. Maybe targeted sanctions of regime figures rather than sweeping sanctions is one method. Um, but it's an abomination. Still, I don't think attacking British police just for doing their job is the right answer either. And they have to protect the embassy. That's if they don't, and the protesters storm the embassy, then Iran will just use that as an excuse. That's all the British aren't protecting us. They're waging war in Iran, and they'll use all their demagoguery language. Um, I hope this young woman gets justice, and I hope there's sufficient anger that at least she can get some justice. That the particular police involved are held to account. But this regime being what it is, at most they'll probably get a bit of a reprimand, if that. Unfortunately, I don't think. I mean, they should go to jail for negligence at the very least, but I don't think it's going to happen. Um, anyway, yeah, let me know your thoughts if you're Iranian. It's it's an important situation. I just don't think it's going to be a turnaround, unfortunately. Last point, I mentioned Western feminists, and when they get into the women's march and they talk about solidarity with the hijab and all, that's all very well. What about solidarity for courageous Iranian women who defy this? Just for once, can they include that in one of these feminist marches? And hijabi women who insist it's their choice. I want to see them defending the right of other women not to wear the hijab. If they expect women to defend their right to wear it, they should defend other women's right not to wear it if it's really about choice. And they should acknowledge that in Iran, at least, there is no choice. There really isn't. Because if a woman doesn't wear it, she'll be accused of violating the morality laws. That's the reality of it.